Hi, this is Mike Hibbert again with the second part of a Django series, Django Python web development system. Um, we're going to be continuing our example of a basic test website that we set up in our first example. I've so far created the test project, and we're now actually logged into the virtual environment, as you can see by this section here. And the next bit we're going to do is we're going to look at settings inside of our application. So more specifically to do with what kind of database this web app system was going to use, and also a little bit about time zone and language codes. But that's mainly just so that when we come to do things like inserting timestamps into our databases, we get the right ones that are suitable for us. So the first part we're going to look at is the settings.py. Now that's located within our new test project inside of the test project folder called settings.py, and in there you should see this is your output. This is automatically generated, so you don't have to write all of this yourself, and you don't have to cut and paste it from some web page or something. It'll once you've created your project like we did in the last lesson, you should find these files all here. Now for the purposes of this tutorial series, we're going to be using SQLite, because then that doesn't necessarily need you to have to install any extra databases. If you want to know how to do MySQL or any of the other databases, then there are a few more little details that you'd have to put in, but not much. In the case of our SQLite database, in our section that says engine, we just have to complete the end of this line, and it's already filled this bit in for us. We just have to say on the end which one we want, and in our case it's SQLite 3. We just save that, and there's only one other field we have to fill in for SQLite, which is why we're using this, because it's much simpler than going into massive details, and that's this. So we put our name in, and it has to be the path to where we'd like to put it, and in my case it's inside of my project that I've created in the example, and I'm going to call it storage.db. As for the other options, user, password, host and port, those are options that you'll only use in things like MySQL, where you'll create a user and you'll have a password, and your host could be either a local host, or it could be an IP address of a remote machine, and the port could be the default port or some one that you've changed for security reasons. But in this case, with our with our SQLite database, we're not using that. We're just going to store things locally, just for the purposes of demonstrating how it gets done. But it isn't much of a step further to just connect to a different type of database. It's just those extra 4 details. The next bit we're going to look at is the time zone. Now time zone for you might be America, Chicago. I hope it is, because that's probably a nice place in the world. But me, it's Greenwich, if you want to be precise. And that gives me my UK time zone. And then finally, my language code is not ENUS, because I'm not in the United States, it's ENGB. Now, you didn't have to set the language code there, but it is useful later on if you try to do things like Unicode. And later in this lesson, we're going to cover a little bit of Unicode that'll get affected by that, but I'll show you that later at the very end. So that's our settings.py setup. the next section is now just to basically start an app within our project. Now our project is an area that was set aside, but it can contain several apps, and apps are basically, if you've used Python in other ways, you'll think of apps as Python packages, and these are separate little modules that can be imported into Django to assist you in your web applications. Now we're going to create an app called articles, and in the article we are going to basically make a pluggable version of something like a wiki post or a blog post or something like that. Just an article with a title and a body, the date that you published it, and how many likes it's got so far. And we're going to keep it very simple, just to demonstrate how you start with the database side of things, and also start using data on your pages. So to start this off, what we need to do is go Python manage start app, and we're going to call it article, and press enter, and that should then have installed inside of here alongside our manage.py and our Django test project folder, which keeps all our settings. We now have the article app, which can now be imported into our project. In the future, if we had another website, we could probably take that folder out of there, that article folder, drag and drop it into another instance of our another project, another Django project, and then we could then use that again, and that would follow the dry development pattern. In other words, don't repeat yourself. So we wouldn't repeat ourselves, we would just basically get that code again, use it again, having written it once, which is really handy if you haven't got much time to sit there and reinvent the wheel every day. So just to bear that in mind, that's really one of the basic ideas behind Django. Is you write something once and then you can piece together new applications all the time with the stuff that you've already written. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we need to go and have a look inside of article. So what do we get in there? We get 4 files. We get this init.py, and you'll notice that its size is 0, because that file is only there to tell Python that this folder is actually a package or a module. And that's all that file does. It tells Python this can be imported as a module. Within our module, we've got models, tests, and those are for your unit tests, and views. And views are used later, probably in the next tutorial, to show how we can actually put information on web pages. But for the time being, we're going to just stick with the idea of models and how they are created and how they work within Django. And then next time I'll actually go into more detail about how you can actually use them on web pages. We're going to concentrate solely on models at the minute. So I'm going to open that up in our Wing 101. That should now be in there, and you can see there's nothing in there now. Okay, so what we need to do first of all is we've already imported models from our Django DB library, and that should be there by automatically, so you shouldn't have to type that in. You should just be able to go class article. Yep, I spelled that right for time and then completely confused myself and thought I hadn't. So models dot model. Okay. Now this basically tells us that this new class article inherits some of the properties from models.model, which is a standard base class that helps us to create representations of data within the system of our applications. So we've told it that that's what the class is called. Now we're next going to tell it what kind of members it has. So we said an article has a title, a body, a published date, and some likes. So how many people have liked this article. So the first thing is the title. So title equals models, and within the models we want it to pick a char field. And we want its max length to equal 200. That tells us that we can have a title that's 200 characters long. Now all of these fields in the database have a type that we can assign. Some of them need a length, some of them do not need a length, some of them need extra parameters. All of that information is available if you just basically go onto the Django website. There's a big list of all the different types and how you can use them. But these are just the basic ones that I think are probably most appropriate, in my opinion, for a bog standard text-based article. So my next file or field is body, and I'm going to say models text field. Not doing very well with the typing today, and I don't want to add anything into there because the text field is just a big chunk of text. It's not a maximum length. It can grow, it can be a huge big paragraph or pages and pages of information, so we're not going to restrict that. Another field is pub date or published date, and this one is where we're going to start and get into the interesting idea of time zones and such. So this is where we're starting to get to rely on the settings that we created in our settings.py. So date time field, and we want date published. And likes is another, well, if it's an integer, it's going to be integer. Integer field, and we're not going to say that that has to be limited in any way. So that's our models.py. Okay, now we're going to go to the terminal now, and I'm going to show you how our Django system actually goes ahead and implements the database. Now we've set in our settings earlier, if we just remind ourselves of that the database is to be here, called StorageDB. But when we look in there, there is no StorageDB. And that's because we haven't told Django to create it yet. So how do we create the database and get it set up ready? The way we do that is we use another command line argument from the manage.py file. So Python manage, and the command we're going to use is syncdb. Now we haven't created a DB, but syncdb will actually do the whole legwork of doing that. Now, what does syncdb do after it's created the file? Well, if you ever want to see what it is to look in there, you can use the SQL command. I'll use that in a moment when I show you the articles and what that does to the database when we start including that. But for the time being, I'm just going to sync the DB. It should be very quick. Now at this point it's saying, do you want to create super users? And I just want me to be the super user so far, so leave it blank if it says just me to use Mike. That'll do fine. Email address hibbert.michael@gmail.com. Please feel free to email me with any questions or anything that you want to ask about in terms of this. Now you have my email, but not my password. Right. So that's our database created, and we should now, if we do an ls, see storage.db in the list there. Now, what does that give us? If I use my SQLite database browser, I can go into there and find in there that it gives us a load of tables. It gives all of these things by default, just by creating the database. You'll see most of these things are auth or Django content type, Django session, Django site. And this is the basic set of tables that the basic set of Django modules need. You'll notice there's nothing in there about articles. And why not? Because after all, we defined the model. The reason why not is if we go back to our settings, we have another group of settings a little bit further down past where we did our language. We've got installed apps. We haven't yet told it about our new installed app. So if we do that, just add that into the line there, go back to our command line, we should now be able to sync DB. Yep, so we've got some errors, and there we are. I'm missing S. Like I say, I'm having a bad typing day. There we go. So that fixes that. Creates in our database the new articles table. So if I go back into my program for browsing through, we should now see article underscore article with an ID which we didn't define but was put in automatically by Django, a title with 200 characters long, a text body, a publish date, which is a date time field, and a likes field, just as we defined it. What's really interesting about this is that we haven't written any SQL, but if you're in the position where you don't necessarily have the permissions to go and create tables through Django, there is a way around it. What you would do is you do the SQL command, like I was just explaining to you earlier. Now what we do, SQL article, and that will tell you what the actual commands are. So what you would do in the case of this is, if you probably have access to some way to execute SQL in your web hosting services, for instance. You could cut and paste that into there and execute it through that terminal instead, and that would create your tables, etc. Not the nicest way of doing things, but then again, if you haven't got a root server and you're working through a control panel like CP or some other thing like Plesk, you're not going to necessarily get direct access because it's not secure. You might be on shared hosting, but that's the way to get around it if you're in trouble like that. So, say for instance that we decided that we're going to change the article module, and any of these field or data types changed. Unfortunately, it's not very easy to get rid of that kind of change after you've done it, so it's well worth thinking about, how exactly what you want to do with your model before you actually activate it by putting it in that line in the installed apps list. What you need to do if that does happen, however, is you can go back and say Python manage py reset article. Now it'll say, are you sure you want to do this? Yes. Okay. And then that'll remove the table from inside the database. Let's not do that. I'll just make sure that returned our table. Yeah, so let's brought that back in the way we need it. So that's great stuff. We can close that now and we'll stop messing around with that. One thing to be careful of that reset command. This reset command will kill all of your data as well as your table schema. So it's worth, really being careful about before you actually set up something and introduce it into the database. If you really seriously want to keep your data, then try to get it right before you actually put it in there. Right, so the final thing that I'm going to show you is how do we actually use these models. Now, I'm not going to show you from the point of view of using them in views, because that's for next tutorial. This time I'm going to show you using a handy little tool that the manage.py system has, which is called the shell. Now the shell is basically a Python shell, but it allows you to import local modules from your current app that you're using, as if they were actually part of Python. So for instance, we've defined our article. What we can do next is go from article.models, remembering that article has a file called models, import article. Okay, now this will have imported the article model, and to list all articles within there we can go article objects all, and that'll tell us that there's no objects in there at the minute. So let's put some objects in. To do that, we need to create an instance of an article. I'm going to say title equals test1. I won't concentrate much on the spelling. And the body equals blah, and our pub date need to backtrack, because one thing that I didn't bring in there is that we need to rely on our time zone information that we set in the py, in the settings.py. So to get that, we need to go from Django .utils import time zone. Time zone will allow us to be able to generate things like timestamps for right now in our current time zone that was set in the application. So then I'll try again. Title, test1, body, blah, pub did equals time zone now. That'll give us the current time zone and the current timestamp for our time zone, and this is how we can then keep our system dates and times within the regions that we're actually running the servers. And finally, our likes, I'm going to set these to all 0. That's creating an instance of an article object. The way that we actually save this is strangely called save. Now, if we go a.id, we'll see that has an ID now. So let's create a couple more articles. Test 2. I'm just going to keep everything exactly the same, and then again save, and there's its ID number 2. And finally a number 3. Okay, that seems to have worked. So if we do article.objects.all now, we should now get 3 objects, because we're pulling all 3 out of the database, which we do. However, this doesn't give us much of a chance to tell which one is which. We could possibly make a loop and go through there, but there's a nice little feature that probably will make our lives a lot easier. Now to do this, I'm just going to drop out of this shell. I'm going to go back to our models, and I'm going to say def underscore Unicode return self dot title, and this will show in our second part of the object definition, because this part is the bit that uses the Unicode option. So it should output the title in this section and in here. So then we can see that it's an article and what the title is. So let's open up the shell again. From article models import article, and then if we do article objects all, we now see that instead of just saying an article object, it tells us the title. So now we can more easily distinguish between these when we're just at the code level, which is really handy later on in our development. So there you go, that's why we used our Unicode stuff, and this is why we set our option for language code, because once you start playing with languages and language codes, then you're going to get into Unicode, and that's something that I'm going to put in a future tutorial. because I'm not going to make this much more complicated than it already is. That's the end of the tutorial. I hope it was informative for you. If you liked this video, then please click the like button. If you want to see more tutorials, then please subscribe to this channel. Thanks for watching.